Okay, Grant.
But do me a favor, and just throw those earphones over to me. Right behind me.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to turn it over to Rebecca to kick us off in 1 minute. But in the meantime, this webinar will be in both English and French. So please follow the instructions that are projected on the screen now to choose your selected channel if you'd rather hear it in English or in French. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A chat and we'll do our best to answer them. But now I'll turn it over to Rebecca Lundgren to start us off.
Thanks, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here to welcome you to our webinar today on the ups and downs of scaling norm shifting interventions. Next, please. All right, thank you. Addressing social norms and programs is critical to improving health and meeting our development goals. The work of passages, research, intervention, monitoring and evaluation, and scale has been organized around key life transitions in mind, understanding that these phases represent opportunities for norm shifting. Next, please. Evidence generated by passages and also by others continues to grow, demonstrating that it is possible to design scalable norm shifting interventions and take them to scale within and outside of the health sector, including programs or interventions that address adolescent and youth reproductive health and well-being, violence prevention, and gender equity. Our panelists today will discuss some of the specific challenges of scaling norm shifting interventions, as well as the growth and the possibilities in this so critical area of work. Next, please. So this is the final event in a series of 4 webinars that Passages has been putting on, each covering a key element of the Passages legacy, from advancing understanding to improving implementation, enhancing evaluation, and now to strengthening scale up. Next, please. Scale up has been at the heart of Passages from its inception. In fact, scale up is embedded in each of our 3 results area: establish an evidence base on scalable norm change, assess and provide technical assistance and catalytic support for scaling social norms interventions, and advancing knowledge dissemination and utilization. So with that very brief introduction, I would like to turn the floor back to Jamie to move us forward.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So today, we're so excited you're all joining us. Speakers, if you're not speaking, could you mute yourselves, please? We will be starting with a panel where we'll ask 2 speakers to reflect on there's the changing scale-up paradigm over the last few years. I'll turn it over to Susan to talk about Passages' contributions to this legacy area. And then we'll close with another panel where we'll invite more speakers to reflect on their experiences with scale-up of their norm-shifting interventions. So we'll also have the chance to answer a couple questions. So please use the Q&A box if any come up throughout the presentation. So thank you so much. So in the past 5 or so years, as Rebecca was saying, there has been more and more evidence gathered and published on norm-shifting interventions going to scale. This includes the contributions by Passages that are the subject of today's webinar, and on which our panelists and speakers will share valuable lessons. Moving to a scale-up framework shifts the way that one thinks about social and behavior change projects. Rather than having a finite project objective and an endpoint within the project lifecycle, a scale-up lens makes one think longer term, what at Passages we've called beginning with the end in mind. For norm-shifting interventions, the scale-up lens means the possibility of reaching more people in different areas over time, with new or shifted social expectations about appropriate behavior and ways of thinking, leading in turn to more health-enabling environments. So I have 2 questions each for Francesca Quirke of Tier Funds, who will be talking about a faith-based intervention transforming masculinities, and Mariam Diakité, who will be talking about an intervention called the Husband School. We have many speakers and we'll ask them to quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll project a slide with their affiliations and roles at the end as well. So thanks so much to our speakers. And Frankie and Mariam, my first question for each of you is, from where you sit, has your organization's thinking changed in the past 5 years about the scale up of community-based norm shifting interventions or other SBC projects, social and behavior change projects?
I'll go first, let Mariam, if that's okay, Mariam. So yeah, just quickly, Francesca Quirke, I'm part of the Gender and Protection Unit at Tearfund, and we work in around, the organisation works in around 50 countries around the world on community-based development through faith institutions. So I think, yeah, just to answer that question in 2 parts, Jamie, I think firstly, there's definitely been a growing interest in understanding social norms in general, and what norm, you know, what are the specific characteristics of norm shifting interventions? What is some of the models and the understanding, the theory that shapes it, and then obviously how can we put that into practice in effective ways and measure it? So I think there's definitely, you know, that increasing interest within Tearfund to think about norms in that specific and targeted way. And also, you know, think about scale up. Similarly, bringing in a lot more thinking around how to design for scale, how to make it possible, as you're saying, to from the outset be thinking about what are the pathways to scale, who, you know, who's going to take it on board, and therefore how can we make the intervention from the get-go, you know, appropriate for scaling, thinking about how to think about the essential elements, what's going to be possible to take on outside of the project funding. So I think Passages has really given a language and an understanding and a theory to that, which there's increasing interest for within Tearfund. Thank you. I'll pass over to Mariam.
Thanks so much, Frankie. Mariam, thinking from your perspective, how has your organization or interventions thinking changed in the past 5 years?
Oui. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. With respect to that question, I work on the Passages project, and we have been supporting other social norm change programs that have been scaled up. And so what I would say over the past 5 years, what I've noticed over these 5 years is that we've had a lot of different ways that we have scaled up. We have some organizations that have done their intervention, it worked well, and they had solid proof that it was effective and working. But then when it went to scaling up, there were some missing elements. Those elements are capital if we really want to be able to scale up these interventions successfully. For example, as Frankie was just saying, she was talking about the theory of change, and this is extremely important to prepare scale up, because we have to be able to understand where we're going and how we're going to get there. So over the past 5 years, I've noticed that more and more people are understanding the importance of this theory, and the theory is helping us to meet our goals. In addition to that, when we talk about scaling up, at the beginning, we talked about scaling up certain interventions, but now when we talk about scaling up sometimes a little more broadly. And there have been interventions or projects that have been tested and piloted and effective, but sometimes we don't, when that scales up, the intervention isn't being implemented as faithfully as it was when we had the initial intervention, and it might be implemented more broadly or differently. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those thoughtful answers. I thought it was interesting that you both touched on the sort of Passages Consortium thinking on theories of change. So my next question is a little bit broader. So thinking about, Frankie, Tier Fund and Mariam, the many interventions that you've worked on under Passages, from your perspective, are you seeing the programming paradigm starting to expand overall? So are you seeing longer term thinking to include planned scale up to new areas and new actors from the beginning of an intervention or an innovation?
Is it okay if I go again,
Je
Mariam?
peux dire oui.
I would say yes. For example, with Husband School, it started in Niger in the field of reproductive health. And now, even in Mali, I'm seeing projects that are using the Husband School model. For example, there's a nutrition project that is also using the strategies developed under Husband School to also achieve their results. So that's why I was saying we might start, but we don't always know where it's going to end when we get to scale up. But I think what's essential is that we understand that the intervention works and that we want to expand it. But when we expand it, we have to look at how we're going to do it, under what form. It could take different forms. It could be institutionalized. In Mali, for example, we've seen organizations that have scaled up just at short term to boost their results, but they didn't go beyond that. And then there are others who have been using these interventions and seeing where they could continue them, or sometimes they may be stopped after a certain point. So I don't say there are any limits. I don't see any limits, in fact.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Frank.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I think, so TIFAND works a lot with church structures and church faith institutions, so supporting both community-based interventions, but also a lot on like influencing theological teaching and kind of denominations. And so I think Passages has really helped think about how to take, so kind of, we've got the work that we do with institutions, but I think the scale up thinking has really refined and made it a lot more effective, thinking about now this pathway from projects into thinking about that institutionalization through churches from the beginning, and thinking about the, bringing those discussions about those pathways and ownership by the faith institutions right from the beginning of the project, so that as soon as we're starting, we're seeing that ongoing, more sustainable journey. So I think from Passages, there's been a lot of better understanding and language. Sometimes there wasn't always a language for kind of how to do these things or what's important. And thinking about all the kind of nuts and bolts rather than just kind of like, we'll do this and then we'll see kind of how it, spontaneous maybe scale up, but really thinking about what are the specific attributes of partners that can support scale up? How do we really engage stakeholders, from the beginning and really be intentional about bringing everyone on board on that scale up journey? And I think something that Mariam, you also mentioned, also what does the kind of technical support or the accompaniment look like at scale could be quite different in terms of, as there's adaptation and scale, it might look different. And so how do you kind of keep that balance? I know that we always talk about with fidelity and scale. And so continuing to look at how to give support and guidance as things scale. But yeah, I think definitely it's helped within TIFAND think more about that long term and that more thoughtful planning for institutionalization.
Thank you both so much for those reflections on the scale up programming paradigm and talking about the different pathways for institutions. Yes. Please go.
Je voulais juste
I just wanted to add one point because when I was having a discussion with Issa, who is working with us in Niger, he was saying that thanks to the support from Passages, they are now thinking about how they can reduce the costs of the husband school project, because when they developed and implemented their project, it had a significant cost. But now with the support of Passages, they've been able to start thinking about and analyzing how they could scale up and be more cost effective. So I think that this is also something that is helpful when we, if we're able to make it more cost effective, that will also help in scaling up these interventions and being able to have the programs or projects in various different areas. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam. And thank you again to Mariam and Frankie for sharing your rich experience on scale up for different innovations in different settings. I'm going to pass it on to Susan, who will highlight Passages' contributions to the scale up field. So thank you so much again to both panelists, and over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Jamie. Let me just start sharing the slide deck again. It's visible?
Yes, but it's not full screen yet.
Yes. Okay. So for the next 10 minutes, maybe 11, we're going to take you on a little whirlwind tour about the work that we've done in Scale Up as part of Passages. As Rebecca was saying, it's very, it's been embedded in everything that we do, whether it's research, practice, technical assistance. Just a little time on why focus on it and why study scale up processes, how we actually did it, and what are some of our lessons learned. There's been a lot of documentation at individual project level, but in the past year, a group of us, Mariam, actually Diakité, Rebecka Justice, and I have been really working to focus on like, what are the big 10 lessons? So we'll be sharing some of the results of that comparative analysis. Focus on community-based norm shifting interventions. So let's just do just a little definition. Norm shifting interventions really seek to influence behavior, but sort of at that normative level, the enabling environment level. And you see our little man here in the right, and that little bubble at the bottom left. All my friends have many children, and even if I want only 2 children, I may have more because everyone else does. So it's these kinds of social influences that even if you are this person in this slide who has knowledge, who has access to services, can actually have a huge influence on what decisions you make and how you see what your options are. So that's kind of the area of norm shifting interventions, a part of SBC that Passages has been focused on, community level. And then the other definition is scale up. So we worked a lot, mostly with the World Health Organization ExpandNet scale up framework as we conceptualized and then actually rolled out Passages. And so this is their definition. And I think Frankie and Mariam were just talking about, really looking, and ours isn't the only, it's not the only framework. I mean, we were also inspired by others like MSI as we were going on it, but really thinking of how do you expand out? How do you really try and institutionalize? And how do you keep adapting so that you don't lose the core of what you initially began with? This is kind of our journey. We initially started with like, what exactly is the status of norm shifting interventions being scaled, coming from gender, HIV. There wasn't a lot of process documentation on scale. It seemed to be a huge gap, yet that's where that would be most useful to organizations who want to do scale up. So we really then started focusing on what are NSIs and their relation to the larger SBC movement. And also there was a lot of discussion and reflection on what about ethics when you're working in the norm space. How do you make sure that your program decisions aren't creating greater inequalities or reinforcing power structures that maybe stop young people, for example, from acting? So how do you think ethically as you're actually working with NSIs? It's a larger issue for health promotion more generally. Then the last couple of years have really been just sort of documenting. A lot of process documentation and learning studies were done at the different projects levels within Passages. That bottom band, that arrow at the bottom really shows our approach to build. And I think Frankie and Mariam were just talking about it, how we were really intentional about building core and our partner staff's understanding and capacities in thinking and planning and executing scale-up processes, and doing targeted learning on scale-up issues along the way. We had some guideposts that guided that work, and I'm not going to talk too much on them because a lot of the lessons learned are reflections of these. But how do you, as you're scaling up, how do you design and adapt for scale up, right? Theory of change, looking, a lot of the community-based NSIs really work outside of health systems. So how do you create linkages to services and information? Things like that. Monitoring the big issue, the big reality of a lot of NS norm shifting interventions is they can create social pushback. So how do you then manage that as a project? How does the community manage that? Those kinds of discussions. So the five norm shifting interventions that are kind of the focus of today's discussion are listed here. So the bottom, GUG, growing up great, GHD, girls who are very young adolescents, trying to create more gender even support as young people go through puberty, but reaching different adults you can see in their lives. They're each conceived quite differently, but they're working with that same aim. Terikunda Jekulu and Masculinité, Famille et Foi, we're really working with young adults and other adults and working in different settings. TJ is working with NGOs and the ministry very closely. MFS is working, as Frankie was saying, sort of within a network of faith-based organizations, the Église de Cristo Congo, ECC. So, but they were working to really reduce social barriers to thinking and acting, developing intentions on family planning, so that normative environment, and looking at gender equality, men and women, and couple and community sort of aspects on gender, being gender even. And then husband schools, we're really working with model husbands in Niger who would go out and try and convince men who were big block to women using family reproductive health services to try and get them to get other men engaged in supporting women. And what does that mean in terms of gender? So when you lay them out on our little wave diagram that comes from the one of the documents, the considerations for scale up that was developed with many members of the learning collaborative, as well as many, including many in passages and our partners. You can see that, you know, you have the innovation, the introduction, the integration phase, and how these are five that we're talking about kind of lay out at the bottom at different points, right? Which also means then that they had different types of scale up questions, learnings that we wanted to try and focus on as part of passages. So you can see that they had different aims, and these are just some of the different learning kind of questions that we were focused on. Each of them had a specific set that they worked on, but girls' holistic development, who was really just in that early introduction and innovation stage, didn't have a lot of proof on how norm shifting interventions, what was the norm shifting effect. You know, so that was, we were looking at effectiveness for them at that point, whereas growing up great, Masculinité, Famille et Foi, we're really looking at how do you transfer responsibilities to the ministries or the NGOs or the faith or the congregations and the networks, the ECC to take on responsibilities for some of the implementation so that you have a sustainability aspect to the work, the really important work that's being done. Terikunda Jekulu is a nice example of moving a norm shifting intervention from Benin to Mali, where nobody even knew about it. And how do you expand and adapt in a totally new setting, create demand for it? And husband schools were really operating at scale. So the big question for them was, how do you know that it's working equally in different places since it's already working at scale, especially the norm shifting, the gender effect of that project. So what did we learn? We're just going to talk about common challenges and 10 key learnings from this comparative analysis that is now you can find. We created a slide doc, so it has a lot more detail than what I'm sharing with you today. So there are some specific challenges to norm shifting interventions, and you can see them there. We already talked about them mostly. But what are some of the things that we learned? And so one is respecting the core scale up principles. We know that there's some principles that make a planned scale-up process work, and and you need to use them for norm shifting interventions, as well as within health service delivery systems or education systems. Mariam was referring to the theories of change, and that became really crucial because if a new organization trying to scale up an existing intervention doesn't understand how it's supposed to lead to normative shifts, well, you get really lost really quick, and you can lose the heart of what made that intervention so important in the first place. Also interesting is, as we were going through our comparative analysis, ministries and NGOs, everyone understands the role of culture and norms around and health behaviors, right? But how do you actually address it programmatically is kind of a conundrum. And so having NSIs that were tested was a nice way to help partners who wanted to engage more actually engage with it in a way that was useful to their other programming. Some lessons learned on, again, implementing by new organizations. So one of the big lessons is how do you adapt materials with the stakeholders who are going to be using them as you move to a new place. That was important in Mali, that was important with Growing Up Great in Congo, and working with stakeholders. It also makes it more acceptable. There's greater buy-in. The whole funding issue, which comes up repeatedly and isn't actually unique just to NSIs. If everyone agrees that you want to pass the implementation responsibilities and M&E responsibilities, without funding, it makes it difficult. And so the whole idea of how do you think about funding and resources is important. And then the other thing, relating to people who are doing SBC already, but they're kind of unsure about working into the normative space, but with small tests, you build confidence, and then the implementation partners became much more invested because they saw, oh, this works and I see this impact. Looking at institutionalization, seizing opportunities for NSIs as they arise, and again, going back to this kind of a new type of intervention that has these different effects than a regular IEC or than other health promotion. How do you have to build into technical assist as you're handing over moments so that people can reflect and build their own confidence about what they're doing. And then finally, evaluation and learning. It's possible to monitor community social change. That's one of the things you're really looking at when you're working with norm shifting interventions, and feasible. So even small things like with regular staff meetings, every 6 months or so, there would be a pause and reflect section. What are we learning about? What is the social change we're seeing? What are we learning about it? You can have supervisors every time they go out to the field also ask explicitly and regularly, like, what are you seeing going on, so that you can monitor it and then adjust as you need it. If things like social pushback happen, for example, then you can address it immediately. And then finally, we have the MEL acronym, which is everywhere, but it's actually not that easy in practice. There's a big focus on monitoring, not necessarily learning, and that's even built into how do you put learning, how do you make it part and intentional of M&E systems? So that's one of the big issues. And, donors are really focused on certain types of outputs and not necessarily focused on learning. So there's this inherent tension in MEL world that needs to be brokered. So what comes next? These 5 organizations were working before we came, and they'll continue after. So this is just one moment in a larger time frame. And their scale-up stories will continue after Passages ends. So I just wanted to thank today's panelists, not everyone. Oops, sorry, we're not there yet. So now we wanted to just have some reflections more from different panelists, some of them who are on this list today, right? So I think I'm going to stop sharing. There's going to be time for questions, I hope, at the end. But right now, what we wanted to do was invite some of our partners who, have been on we've all been on this scale-up journey together. And so I wanted to invite Jen Gales and Dr. Mbadu from the Ministry of Health in Congo to reflect on growing up great. Mariam Diakité and Robert Dabou of the World Bank SWED project to reflect on TJ expansion in Mali, and Tier Fund, Frankie Quirke and Ospy Nzigire to reflect on from their perspective Tier Fund. So panelists, are you ready? Unmute yourselves, I guess. So I guess I'm going to speak in French. I'll continue speaking in English. So I want to ask you 3 questions, and we'll and just to have each intervention, the people who've been involved in implementing with a scale-up lens intervention, just sort of reflect on it. So could you share your thoughts on developing collaborative partnerships to foster scale up? How does that actually happen? How does that become a reality? Second question is if you could offer one piece of advice to others based on your experiences in planning or implementation or monitoring evaluation of a scale up effort, what would it be? And given your passage's experiences, could you comment on how your view of scale-up interventions has shifted? We already sort of heard a little bit about that, but it'd be nice to have other people sort of add some of their thoughts. So could we maybe start with growing up great? Jennifer and Dr. Mbadu, to just reflect on those questions.
I think we'll let Dr.
Oui,
Mbadu
est-ce que
go
je-
first. Oui, Dr. Mbadu.
Yes,
vas-y.
go ahead, please, Dr. Mbadu. Thank you. I would like to start. Yes, so I will start with the second question, the question which is the easiest for me, even though I'll try to also answer the other questions. And I would say that we were beneficiaries of the passage's approach. In other words, I mean the government, because I am the director of the program, the National Health Program for Reproductive and Adolescent Health, and we really benefited from the passage's approach. So if I had a piece of advice to offer or to answer that part of the question, I think that it is important to involve all project beneficiaries from the beginning to the end, from the planning stage at the very beginning, through adaptation and scale up even to evaluation and learning, because all the different beneficiaries have their various problems and challenges, and working together, we can find solutions. So among the beneficiaries of the Passages Project, we have adolescents, you have parents, you have teachers, you have health service providers, and even people who are involved in implementation, such as community organizations and other community actors. So all these different beneficiaries need to be involved from the very start. And I think that's what's going to make the project most successful. Also, it's important to look at the tools that were used in this approach. And these tools have shown that we can increase knowledge, because we've had studies and analyses that have shown that we have been able to increase awareness and knowledge. We've been able to help girls and boys gain more knowledge. And so if you involve all the beneficiaries at the very beginning, then I think that this would be the biggest piece of advice I would give, because we've all benefited from this project. As the government, we've benefited, and we've seen that when all the different beneficiaries and adolescents themselves, the young people, the teachers, the health providers, when everybody is involved, this creates a dynamic. And in the end, this is what helps us achieve good results. So I don't know if I've answered the question or not, but and perhaps there may be some other questions I think you asked. The third question, given my passage's experience, can I comment on how my view of scale-up interventions that aim to foster more enabling normative environments has shifted over time? Well, I would still answer this from the point of view of a government entity. And I would say that the growing up great and growing up great plus approaches that we used under passages have been very useful for the Ministry of Health and the government. And it's been very useful for us because this approach enabled us to ensure that we had an educational, the ministries of education and health were able to work together. And this was something that we hadn't seen previously with other interventions. For example, when we brought school children to visit health centers, and then when they got to the health clinic, they were able to ask the doctors and the nurses questions about issues related to contraceptive methods or puberty issues. And so this was an environment that before would have been not really possible because of the taboos and subjects that were sensitive. But now, because of this joint collaboration, the students were able to ask questions and visit the health center. And so in the end, interpreter notes this sound is cut out. So in the end, we saw that the young people, the adolescents, were then more open to using contraceptive methods because our interventions for very young adolescents from 10 to 14 years old, and then for adolescents 14, 15 years old and older, these interventions allowed us to learn a lot. And we realized that one of the biggest obstacles was having more dialogue between parents and their children. And this approach enabled parents also to be more involved. It involved everybody. So it was really a very good approach. And even when we scaled up, we thought more and more about how we could continue having projects that involve parents, because we realized we couldn't continue doing this type of projects if we didn't involve parents and the communities, and if we didn't have everybody's buy-in and involvement. As we saw in our follow-up studies and our evaluations, we saw that when everybody's involved, it works much better. So with these interventions, we saw that the Passages Project gave us a lot of tools, even the flip books and various other tools and books about puberty and adolescence. These were things that the young people and the adolescents were able to use. And this helped improve their level of awareness and understanding. And for us, we also learned a lot, especially with the younger adolescents from 10 to 14 years old. At the beginning, we at the Ministry of Health, when we looked at our strategic plan, we were wondering what interventions we should use for the very young adolescents. And with the Passages Project, when we looked at the different activities, we saw that we were able to also target very young adolescents, and we had activities for them. And this was incorporated into our strategic plan. And I think it's been very helpful for our country and for our government. So that's how Passages has been extremely useful to us. And then, yes. Go ahead, finish your comment, please. Go ahead. Okay, yes. And then I also wanted to say that we also learned a lot from this project in terms of how you can accommodate young people and adolescents and how you can integrate health training and education for them, dialogue with their parents, and how we could increase their awareness of family planning services. Then in terms of gender-based violence, because with the Passages approach, we created spaces for communication and information. And with these spaces for communication and information sharing, both girls and boys were brought together in groups. They were able to ask questions, get answers. And I think that this helped us eliminate this sort of gap that there is sometimes between boys and girls in terms of sexual and reproductive health. So that's what I would say with respect to the Passages Project. Thank you very much. Thank you. And Jen, do you have a anything to add? Thank you, Dr. Mbadu. Jen, do you have anything to add? Yes, thank you, Dr. Mbadu.
I think it's interesting. I'm a bit of a latecomer to this webinar, and so I did not coordinate with Dr. Mbadu, but he pretty much said exactly what I would have said for top advice. And I just wanted to maybe say a bit about how we engaged Scale Up partners and the ministries. We were working with the Ministry of Education and Health, and we created a stakeholder reference group. And we really thought hard about how to meaningfully engage them, not just through separate meetings, but including them in our thinking around how to scale, and including them in quarterly learning meetings with other implementing partners, so that they really truly accompanied us in our learning process in the fullest way possible. And if I can just take my speaker's prerogative to maybe flag advice or two things that we struggled with, because I think you're hearing lots of advice about how to do this well, but I think two things that we struggled with and are still working on are resource mobilization for continued implementation after project funding ends, and coordination across ministries, across multiple sectors, and across the government civil society bridge. So I'll stop there so others have a time to respond as well.
Great, thank you so much for these thoughts. And I'd like now to invite Robert, Dabou, and Mariam Diakité to reflect on these same three questions from the perspective of Terikunda Jekulu in Mali, this intervention TJ that moved to Mali after successful testing in Benin. Mariam et Robert, s'il vous plaît. So the three questions,
I'm sorry. Yes, Susan, can I, would it be okay if I drop off the call, if you don't mind, because I have another presentation to do in another workshop. So is it all right with you if I drop off the call? Yes, of course, no problem. And thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts, because even from afar, I've seen that this collaboration with the ministries and all the stakeholders has been very effective. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Okay,
Mariam and Robert.
Thinking of, how do you develop collaborative relationships when you're tout nouveau dans un pays? What advice might you have for others on scale up? And just how has your view of scale up interventions shifted over time, given the TJ experience in Mali?
Thank you. I will start, and then Robert can fill in after me. For the first question, I would repeat what Dr. Mbadu and Jen said, is that it's important to involve all stakeholders from the very start. Like Susan was saying, this project was piloted in Benin, and then after Benin started, we had a steering committee that helped develop the intervention and think through implementation. And then when we moved it to Mali, in order to have a successful project, we had to have this type of collaboration, because from the very get-go, we wanted to provide information to all our partners about the results of this intervention. And also we saw that it was a lot of information that was conveyed from partners to partners. And when they understood that this had been successful, and when we had the involvement of our technical and financial partners, this was also important to scale up. For the second question, what I would say is that it's really important to be flexible. Sometimes you're in the planning stage and you have planned something, but then the reality may be different. So especially with norm shifting interventions, you have to be prepared for the unexpected. So you have to be able to take the time to think about it and to find a way around these unexpected things that can come up. And so that's why passages was very helpful, because we noticed that we had a lot of learning that we could base ourselves on. And this learning helped us not only to understand but it also helped us to be able to adapt the interventions as we needed. And so that's why I think you need to take that into account. This need to be flexible when you scale up. Now, I don't know if Robert would like to say anything else or jump in and add something, or maybe answer question 3. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you very well. Go ahead, please. Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. I'm Robert Dabou. I work with the SWED project, and it's been a pleasure to work with Mariam on the TJ project since 2020. SWED has played an important role. We also work a lot in the area of norm shifting interventions in a lot of different areas for health projects, women's empowerment, girls' education, and so forth. But for the first question, I would say, similar to what Mariam was saying, is that I think it's extremely important to have a partnership. And in order to achieve the desired results, I think you have to have an effective partnership. And also, this is an area where you have to work together in complementarity with all the partners. You have to be able to see what all the different stakeholders are going to be contributing to the intervention, and then to see what everybody's bringing to the table, and then to make sure that we are working together to implement it. And then I also feel that in the development and implementation of the interventions, we, I think, really did a good job following the different stages. And I think all the different stakeholders were very at ease, that they felt like they were able to contribute and collaborate in the context of this project. And I think that's important to have that atmosphere. And then I think also it's important to have not just short-term objectives, but also to think about something that's more sustainable and how you can institutionalize these interventions. So I would say that this partnership needs to be well thought out. It needs to be developed such that everybody can be in communication and contribute. We had various different approaches and interventions and different communities we were trying to reach, and we were working with different partners. So if you don't have collaboration amongst the partners, then you may have some difficulties being able to support the partners in the field. And so this is why I think it's important to involve all the different stakeholders, even the community organizations and everybody. And this, of course, is what is helping us to implement the projects. And it's been important to develop these partnerships. With respect to the second question, I agree with what everybody's already said, and I may be perhaps repeating what my predecessors have said, but my advice would be is that it is, as others have said, very important to involve the stakeholders from the very start. And any person who has some sort of authority in the community needs to be identified as a stakeholder and be involved in this alliance. And so and they need to understand what we're trying to do and the results we're trying to achieve. So when we implement projects, especially in areas that may not be quite as safe, rather, for example, TJ was integrated in different regions, and in terms of the results with participation by community leaders, participation by the beneficiaries and the local authorities, the results showed us that it was important to have very strong involvement by all these different parties. Also, we need to make sure that the communities are also empowered, that it's not just coming in and implementing something, but that we're actually teaching them how to build and develop their own interventions. and so that they can follow up and that they can also have their say in terms of the project's results and implementation. I think another important aspect or another piece of advice I would offer would be to develop materials that are adapted to the context. For example, the picture books that TJ used were well adapted, and so the different images could be adapted to the different communities. The messages were adapted to make sure that we were really able to promote norm change at a very local community level. And then quickly on the last point, in terms of monitoring and evaluation and learning, this also has to be adapted. And I think it's important to also have a good system of documentation. When we started these interventions, at every stage, you have to document, and you need any problems, obstacles, progress, anything that could help further scale up. So that's what I would say about these questions. For the first two questions in particular, and with this Passages project, we were fortunate to be able to work with the TJ's project, and we chose out of 3 NGOs, one local NGO that works on reproductive health, and we experimented with this TJ approach. And the approach changed a lot of lives, my life personally, but also the lives of people in the communities where we were working. And this really helped us make sure that we could start with these community programs and then scale up as well. Thank you, Robert. If you could just sum up quickly so we can give the floor to the others. So maybe sum up in 10 or 15 seconds. Yes, okay, what I was going to say in conclusion is that you have to listen to the stakeholders and you have to listen to what they have to say so that we can improve our interventions and we can make sure that we are really fully integrating their requests and their needs at the community level and not just imposing our perspective. So that's what I would like to say. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
For your thoughts on TG. We want to invite now a last one from Tirfan, a reflection from Frankie Quirke and Ospy Nzigire. And at the end, add Issa, who had problems connecting and was going to help us open the first reflection. I'm going to ask you at the end to just give a few thoughts. But the questions on core for our faith-based intervention, and that was being scaled up within an existing network of congregations. Can you share your thoughts on developing a collaborative partnership to foster scale up? What advice would you have for others who want to do scale up within the types of networks you're working with? And how has your thinking on scale up changed over the time? So Ospy and Frankie.
Ospy, je laisse partager d'abord.
Ospy, I'll let you talk first, and because I don't think we have a lot of time left, so I'll give Ospy the floor first.
And before you begin, if people could stay an extra 10 minutes, that would be great. We only program for 60 minutes, but we're running a bit short on time. So, Ospy. If you're speaking, we're not hearing you. Ospy?
Okay, maybe I can just share some thoughts. Maybe Ospy's sound is connecting. Ospy,
Je suis là.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Okay, great. Thank you so much for giving me the time. In response to the 3 questions you've asked, the first question, our thoughts on developing collaborative partnerships to foster scale. I would say that in response to this, it was important to have a good relationship of trust with the passages team so that we could understand the doctrine, the theory, and the vision, and to really be able to accept this and then integrate it with ECC. This really facilitated collaboration with ECC and helped us to connect with our parishes and congregations and helped us give advice to the religious leaders, because we have one advice that we call COPAC, and through this we were able to have greater access to these groups. And it also really promoted a good working relationship with the Theology Commission, because this commission is one that develops the ECC doctrine. And so this enabled us to really be able to explain to all the different religious leaders the importance of the work of the Passages Project, because we wanted to try to transform the negative perception of masculinity, sexual and gender-based violence. And this is something that wasn't really discussed in congregations before, but because of this collaboration, we were able to introduce this theme, and religious leaders trusted us, and they agreed to allow this project to be done in their parishes. This also facilitated buy-in with the 4 key structures that we were working with. Those structures that were working with women, with men, with young people, and with COPAC, which is the Council of Pastors in Kinshasa. And this was instrumental in promoting better communication with religious leaders. This communication enabled us to have a good atmosphere at every level in our working relations. Also, it helped us to be able to better establish a context and our results that we were aiming to achieve. And we were able to work more easily with the religious leaders. And so this collaboration really helped us. That's the first question. The second question, if I could offer one piece of advice based on my experiences, I would say, to paraphrase what somebody else was saying, you need to take into account at every stage of the planning the different stakeholders. All parties and stakeholders need to be involved at every stage of the planning and implementation. Also, you need to use the different modules in a methodological way, and you have to refer to this methodology in every stage of the project. And this, I think, is what helped instill a greater sense of trust in what we were doing on the part of the different beneficiaries. And also, it's important, therefore, to standardize the program and to make sure that we stick with deadlines and the timelines. We need to have resources and technical support to support implementation and scale up. You also have to identify support structures that can help fill in the gaps in terms of knowledge around the different themes of this intervention. We talked about transforming negative masculinity, promoting gender equality, and combating sexual and gender-based violence. So it's important to share the successes and the failures of the projects and to document them, and then also to focus on accountability and how we can try to overcome the failures in the future. So in conclusion, what I would say for the second question is that you need to be faithful to everything that you're doing, and you need to really explain the relevancy and the importance of these themes, which is which are themes that are very important. And when you are a model, a good positive model, it's very easy for others to then replicate. And Ospy, if you could just try to sum up quickly. Yes, I'll conclude with the third question now. For the third question, I said that we had a lot of training with our targets, the religious leaders, champions within couples, gender champions. And this is what helped implementation, because This was also, since it was based on Holy Scripture, we had the trust of the parishes, and this helped them to better talk about sexual violence and gender violence. And then we were able to really start talking about responsibility and how couples could also explore these issues and talk about gender-based violence and try to deal with it even with at the couple level. So it was important to have these reference points and these Christian-based reference points that helped us transform the ideas of masculinity and sexual violence. In conclusion, we noticed that even at the church level, the COPAC, the Religious Leaders Council, adopted this approach and are integrating it into their own programs for young people and women. And so if the church is changing and transforming, then we could hope that greater society can also achieve this type of transformation and change. Thank you very much for your attention. Frankie, do you want to add anything? One last question, and then I'll give 30 seconds to Issa.
I really think everything has been covered by Ospy and by all the other speakers. I think just something to bear in mind is that almost when you're doing this work, as people have said, because of the need to keep engaging stakeholders at various levels, it's almost like you're doing the intervention, supporting intervention, but it's almost another job, which is the ongoing engagement. And ECC is a huge institution. It's all the Protestant churches in DRC. So it has incredible reach, but at the same time, obviously, such a large institution has its own dynamics, its own bureaucracy, its own challenges. You have to keep understanding who to be influencing to be thinking about that long-term scale up. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Issa, if you have 30 seconds, that's all we can give you, but welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Susan. I just have 30 seconds to present something, or do you just want me to introduce myself?
Please just, you said, nous avons déjà parlé de
Issa, we've
vous.
already talked about you. We've already introduced you and said who you are. So that's fine. Everybody knows who you are. I think you can just, present what you want to say. Okay, so I'll answer the questions. Perhaps the question about the partnerships, and really just in 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Okay, yes. And for scale up, that's all we have, 30 seconds. Okay, well, I think in the process of setting up husband school in Niger, the partnership that we had with Passages starting in 2017, that's when we started talking about it. And then it began in 2018. This enabled us to better conceptualize what we could do on the ground. And this helped us also understand how we could scale up with the different stages, theory of change, analyzing the dynamics. And this helped us to have better results because it gave us a better idea of the impact and the results that husband school could have in terms of the couple dynamics. And so this was something that was very useful. And then I also think that this is a process that's iterative. It changes, it evolves over time. We might have to change things, make adjustments. So this flexibility was also a strong point that enabled us to achieve better results. I think that it was important to sit down all together, to look at it and think about what direction we wanted to take and what results we were hoping to achieve. That's what I would just say quickly about our partnership.
Yeah, it was a really interesting, great experience with UNFPA Niger and Songe. But we are going to close now. So thank you for the people who stayed. I think we're hearing some common trends in terms of this concept of really being flexibility, working multi-level, and always be on the lookout for who is it that we need to be partnering at this moment of scale up. The idea of documentation from Robert, thank you, because it's a really big issue. There isn't a lot of documentation on scale-up processes. And this whole idea of adaptation, of partnerships, and how you create partnerships that are substantive and can move together in terms of learning and adapting and scaling. So I think we're going to close, and as Jamie wrote people that we are going to be, so I'm just going to try and do a screen share, that we'll be sending the webinar. These are some of our panelists today that were coming with us that we worked with over the last 6 years. So we want to thank you. We also want to thank our audience. There's no time for questions, and but we'll be sending out the webinar recording and other information in terms of even what you can, some references that you may want to be interested in looking at further. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, all the audience.
Merci.
And
Thank you.
Thank you all.
okay, I guess we're closing.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci
Au revoir.
beaucoup, merci beaucoup. C'était
Merci
vraiment
Suzanne, au
intéressant.
revoir.
Pour le temps, pour toutes vos réflexions. Merci.
Au revoir.
Merci, merci.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.